Hi, I'm Jon Edwards. I'm one of the church leaders at Ebenezer Baptist Church here in Mold. If you're joining us as a guest, we hope some of our services and presentations have been helpful to you. I'm aiming more towards the regulars at church. I miss seeing you all and look forward to seeing you all soon, God willing. My aim is to ask the question, at least, how can God allow coronavirus? Just a note that I've got a few notes in front of me. If I'm looking away from time to time, I'll be looking at some of my notes. This is a new skill which I'm yet to master, but here goes anyway. Well, the coronavirus pandemic, it's changed all of our lives really overnight. Some of the things we were taking for granted have changed, and some things have changed forever. It's taken away some basic freedoms, being able to visit the park, a game of footy, meeting up with friends for a coffee or an ice cream. And as a church, I think we've had to find some inventive ways of meeting. And although it's been fun, it's not as good as the real thing. Some new feelings of loneliness and isolation, depression, fear, anxiety. These are more and more commonly the emotions and feelings that we've been experiencing, and it's hard going. Going to work as a GP, things have changed quite dramatically. I'm of course forced to think about and to respond to COVID-19 nearly every day. For instance, our waiting room has been quiet, and so we've taken the chance to paint the walls. But on the other hand, I now know what I look like to my patients because I get to see myself as I video consult with patients, and it's unnerving, I can tell you. And I think we've been forced to ask some big questions. What is truly important to me? What are those things that I miss most? And as a Christian, I think one of the hardest questions I find is how can God allow the coronavirus infection to happen in the first place? And if we may have been asked this question already by friends, family, work colleagues, neighbours, and if we haven't been asked, I'm sure many people are thinking it, and if not others, then it's a question that we may be thinking about ourselves very often. After all, it's not that long ago that we've been talking about and thinking about God's grace as a church and studying that together. That undeserved kindness, his goodness towards us. The Bible tells us that God is love. It's full of accounts and characters that just show time and again how good God is. And our own experience is of God's goodness and his grace towards us in the many good things that he gives us day to day. We also know that God so loved the world that he gave his only son who died for us on the cross. So how is it that we can reconcile these two things, that God is good, that he is love, with the fact that there is a worldwide pandemic? Now, unfortunately, the Bible doesn't have a chapter to turn to on why there will be a coronavirus pandemic in 2020. But it does have a lot to say about what coronavirus leads to, which is suffering, isolation, bereavement and dying. And it tells us a lot about how we as Christians can respond to the current situation. The Bible has many more things to say. I hope to just think about four essential things that I pray and hope will be helpful to us in this strange and difficult time. Please note there are lots of resources available and more coming out. So please do come and talk to us as elders. Come and get in touch with one of the pastors if you want to know more about those resources. Well, the first thought relates to our preconceptions about suffering. When we hear of people suffering and dying from coronavirus, naturally we are appalled and outraged. This just should not be happening. And the Bible's first response to this is that we are completely right to feel this way. we read in Genesis an account of how God made the universe, and there's a phrase that is repeated time and again to ram home the message. And God saw that it was good. And God created a good world. Good in the sense of being well made, yes, but more to the point, good in its nature. There was originally to be no suffering, no isolation, no fear, no death, no pandemics. We are entirely right to feel this way, that this just should not be happening. However, the Genesis account, it moves on. It describes Adam and Eve, our first human parents, choosing to trust a lie from God's enemy rather than trusting God himself, their maker. And of course, it's a lie that we've been trusting ever since. We are born Adam and Eve's children, and like them, we are prone to move away from God, away from the source of life. And if we move away from life, there is inevitably only death. And so the Bible's explanation for our suffering, which of course includes everything from being alienated or bullied or murdered, through to suffering from natural causes, cancers, heart attacks, depression, coronavirus. The Bible's explanation is that we can and should expect these things to come our way, and with us the whole of creation, as we are moving naturally away from God towards death. We're no longer entitled to a comfortable life free from suffering. And just think about it in day-to-day life. Nothing lasts, does it? This past week I had to throw away a shirt that had been washed too many times and worn through. I had to pull some weeds up, and with it some plants that I had, which I'd over pruned and managed to kill in the process. I'd over scrubbed the dining room table, trying to remove felt tip pen that the kids had drawn on. Nothing seems to last, and as my patients never tire of reminding me, age doesn't come alone, doctor. We are right to be appalled at the coronavirus pandemic. It was never meant to be this way. But because of sin, we can expect suffering and deterioration and decay and death to be part of our experience. Wouldn't it be nice in a dying world if we could know life? A second really important thought on this comes from the ancient book of Job in the Old Testament. Now, if you're not familiar with Job and the story, he was a billionaire of his day. He had camels and goats and sheep and servants, lots of children as well. And Job loved and worshipped God. His children, well, less so. They're described as partying and revelling and had no thought for God at all. Meanwhile, in the heavenly realms, Satan approaches God and points out the obvious accusation that Job is only loving and worshipping God because of all the good things that God had given him. Notice he makes no mention of Job's children, who had also been given lots of good things, but didn't love God. But never mind. God then allows Satan to test Job, and in a series of terrible calamities, Job lost his wealth, his possessions, and finally even his children tragically die. He went on to lose his health, and some so-called friends and even his wife advised him he must have done something awful, something dreadful to deserve all this suffering, and that he should just curse God and die. And of course, Job loves God, and so he refuses to do so. But towards the end of the account, he does start feeling a bit sorry for himself and starts cursing the day of his birth. And then God, at the end of the book, answers Job. And he doesn't answer in a way that you would expect. He doesn't come to him quietly and comfort him. He doesn't give him a cutch. But rather powerfully and majestically, he reminds Job that God is so much greater than he is, that he understands more, that he knows more, that he is in complete control of everything. And then Job repents in dust and ashes, and God, being God, forgives him and graciously restores him. And it's interesting that it seems likely that during his suffering, Job knew nothing of the battle that was raging between God and Satan. That he knew nothing, that there was a real purpose and meaning to his suffering. And the same is true of us. Often we will never know why we suffer in certain ways. We do know that God sometimes disciplines those he loves. We read about that in Hebrews chapter 12. And we know that God will always work out everything for good in the end. Just read about Joseph's life in Genesis chapter 50, or read Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. But still, wouldn't it be nice to be without suffering, to be without death? Wouldn't it be nice to have life? The third thought comes from Luke and chapter 13. And here some people come and question Jesus after a national disaster. And the question is very similar to Job's friends. Why did these people suffer? What awful thing had they done to deserve suffering in the way that they had? Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, had executed some people in the temple and mixed their blood with the blood of the sacrifices that they had in the temple, something which to devout Jewish believers would have been an unthinkable and defiling act. And Jesus replies to them in a powerful and, as he often did, an unexpected way. And rather than explaining why this had happened to them, he simply tells his questioners that they were no worse than anyone else, but that his questioners should take note of it and take the warning, or some awful disaster would be their fate too. And after talking about man-made suffering, they move on to talk about suffering from a natural cause. There's a tower at Siloam that collapses and kills 18 people in the process. And again, the question, what awful thing had they done to deserve that suffering, and what had happened to them? And again, Jesus answers, they hadn't done anything worse than anybody else, but that people should take this as a warning, as an alarm, as a wake-up call. Otherwise, disaster, suffering, death, it comes our way in this fallen world. And so in this world of coronavirus and pandemics, there is an alarm sounding. There is an alarm of suffering around the globe that should wake us up to our vulnerability and to our mortality. If only there was a way out, if only there was a truth that we could hold on to, if only there was life. So our reaction to the pandemic should be outrage, but not surprise. It may not be for us to know why, but to learn to trust our Maker. And it is certainly a wake-up call to us from spiritual sleep, a wake-up to our need for a saviour, for a rescuer, our need for life. The fourth thought comes from the gospel itself. This time when many are feeling low, feeling lonely, feeling just a bit lost, I think. This powerful message comes from the gospel, and is the reason that I am a Christian. And in the gospel we have God's response to our loneliness and isolation and lostness. God has and is and will continue to respond to our suffering, not from afar, but by entering in to our suffering. But he doesn't enter into our suffering powerless as we are, but he enters into our suffering in order to bring an end to suffering, an end to pandemics, an end to death itself, once and for all. We've been asking the question, wouldn't it be nice to have life instead of death in this fallen world? Well, Jesus said, didn't he, that I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus repeatedly used this divine title of I am, a title that God uses in the Old Testament. And he uses it to tell his disciples and to tell us that God the Son was with them in their fallen world, in their suffering, but that he would bring them, that he would bring us back to God, back to the source of our life, back to our Maker once again. We read in John 3 and verse 16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not die but have everlasting life." God is outraged, he is appalled by coronavirus, and he is determined that it, with all suffering and death, should one day come completely to an end. Isaiah chapter 53 tells us a bit about how this will be. We read this, "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." Jesus suffered more than any of us by dying on the cross, despised, rejected, crushed by the human beings that he himself had made. He suffered by bearing God's punishment for our sin. And he suffered so that we could see an end to our suffering. And having bought us peace with God, we read in the last book of the Bible, how things will be one day. And we've been studying this with Ben, of course. We read this, that "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Then look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God." And then the wonderful words, "He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." And this is God's great plan for the world. Because of his grace, we can choose life. We can choose Jesus. And then there will be an end to suffering, an end to coronavirus, an end to fear, to loneliness, to isolation, to social distancing. But until that day, we need to pray, along with the Apostle Paul in Colossians, that we are strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that we may have great endurance and patience, giving joyful thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. Paul encourages us to never tire of doing what is good, which during a pandemic, it might mean keeping in touch with people by phone or Zoom. We need to keep social distancing going. We need to keep reminding ourselves and our loved ones to wash our hands and sing songs while we do so. We need to keep a watch on vulnerable brothers and sisters and neighbours and friends. We need to every Thursday give a round of applause to NHS workers, to encourage them and to thank them for the work that they do for us. We need to love each other well. We need to be joyful in hope, patient in troubles, and by his grace, we need to be faithful in prayer. Well, I hope people are keeping well and are keeping safe. Quite a few of you now have stopped and had a chat at our gates on your daily exercise walk. So thank you for doing so. It's really good to see people and to catch up. Good to see people on Zoom, and I hope very much that by God's grace we'll be meeting together in the not too distant future. Keep safe, everybody, and God bless.